Good morning. I am Kari Bingen, Senior Fellow and Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. And it is a privilege to welcome you to this discussion featuring Dr. John Patsy Klein and his recent book, Space Warfare, Strategy, Principles, and Policy. Dr. Klein is a Senior Fellow and Strategist at Falcon Research and an Adjunct Professor at George Washington University and Georgetown University. This is the second edition of John's book on space warfare. When the first edition came out in 2006, space warfare was a novel topic. While there was past thinking about such concepts during the Cold War, there had not been a modern take on it, accounting for the growing dependence of our military on space, the increasing number of countries operating in space, and the nascent commercialization in areas such as satellite communications, imagery collection, and launch. The book predated China's direct ascent anti-satellite test in 2007 and the many technological advancements since then. There was no Space Force or U.S. Space Command. So a lot has changed in the 18 years since he last visited this topic. Using the analogy of maritime strategy, John gives us a useful framing for how to think about the strategic concepts of space warfare. His work will benefit students, scholars, and practitioners alike as we tackle the many issues associated with this warfighting domain. To discuss these themes with Dr. Klein, I'm going to turn things over to Makena Young, Fellow in the CSIS Aerospace Security Project. Over to you, Makena.
Good morning. Thank you to everyone joining us online. I'm so pleased to be here this morning with Dr. John Klein, call sign Patsy, to discuss all things about his new book, Space Warfare, Strategy, Principles, and Policy. Dr. Klein is not only a professional strategist, but a retired naval commander and naval flight officer. Before we start our conversation, I want to remind our online audience to please submit questions. We are taking live questions to ask Patsy about his book, Space Warfare in general, or any hot takes he has, which I know there are more than a few. So you'll see a Ask Live Questions box on our event page, and please do so. So Patsy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. As Kari noted, this is the second edition of this book, first published in 2006 and widely regarded as one of the foundational books on space warfare and space strategy. So why did you feel the need to update this, and why now?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I just want to say thanks to CSIS for having me. Thank you, Kari, for that wonderful introduction, and Makena for hosting me. So why another book? You're probably saying, hey, Patsy, you're just trying to sell another book. What's up with that? Kari mentioned, a lot has changed. Just to give you a backstory, when I was at the Naval War College over 20 years ago, I wrote my first paper, Corbett in Orbit. And that was the program I was in, the Mahan Scholars Program, had a simple question: can maritime strategy be used to develop space strategy? And that kind of stuck with me throughout the years. So that paper turned into my first book, which was the first edition. I've pursued other books since then. My second one was, if the first book was Corbett in Orbit, the second book is Corbett is Not Enough. You can't take one theorist and apply it to everywhere. It's more complicated. And then I did a book on irregular warfare, considering competition in the gray zone and below the threshold of armed conflict. So why now? It's been 20 years, Kari mentioned. When I started writing, the predominant view was space was special and it was a sanctuary. We used space for missile warning, for treaty verification, but nobody really considered it a warfighting domain. So we have a Space Force. We openly say space is a warfighting domain. I saw some publications that came out yesterday. Space Force is talking about weapons systems. That's pretty impressive. We have the PRC's rise in space capabilities, a lot of dynamic operations going on there. But also my understanding has changed a lot in the last 20 years too. So I wanted to take a fresh take on a lot of the ideas in there and see if I could set the record straight.
Well, but we're certainly in a more complex environment than we were 20 years ago. And now we have a history of operating in space to point to a bit more. But there's still so many unanswered questions in space policy that I think you really helped the policy community here tease out in your book. One thing I do want to note is that you're a Navy commander and aviator who's written two of the most definitive pieces of literature on space policy and space warfare. So, as we do think through how to approach these different operations in space, like space traffic management or commercial protection of space assets, for example, I think it's important and interesting to note, as you said, that space is not special. It's wonderfully unique, as you say in the chapter of your book, that these issues, are thought about in other domains. They've been largely figured out in the maritime and air domain. So can you talk a bit about how you look at the history of warfare in other domains and how that's applied to space?
That's the fundamental question of the book. So back to space is not special, just wonderfully different. That idea we see in writings throughout the ages. So Clausewitz talks about the enduring nature of war, but the changing character. So, there are strategic principles that are enduring. So I take the ideas, even as we consider space, there's these enduring principles that go back centuries, if not millennia. So I use the maritime analogy for this book, at least primarily. All analogies break down in the end. That's key to know. So they were a specific time and place. But as you mentioned, for the last few years, we're gaining more actual experience on understanding what's happening in the space domain. But historical analogies, strategic analogies still have benefit because fortunately we haven't seen what I would call space warfare. Clausewitz calls it primordial violence. So we haven't seen major destruction in space, and I hope we never do. But there's still some benefit to looking at the seminal works of others. In this case, I use Julian Corbett, who was a British academic at the same time as Alfred Thayer Mahan in the early 1900s. But these enduring principles have to do with lines of communication, strategic positions, the role of the offense and the defense, and what the rivals can do. So I see a benefit there. I do include some of the other seminal works, Clausewitz, Thucydides, and Sun Tzu, and the like. But we can. I always tell my students when I teach, if you want a new idea, read an old book. So let's pick up an old book and see what that has to say.
I love that. And I'd like to kind of tease out some more of those ideas. You open the book discussing why this application is insufficient for space warfare in some areas, how maritime strategy is the closest, yet not quite expansive enough. So can you explain some of those shortcomings you found when applying this maritime-based strategy to the space domain?
Yeah. Like I was saying, you got to be, it's part art, not overextending a strategic analogy, because then you're having negative learning. So there are strengths and downsides to it. So the strengths are that you can pull from strategic elements, the strategic principles, like I mentioned before. What are some weaknesses? If you use Julian Corbett's model, he was writing about maritime strategy for great powers. Alfred Thayer Mahan did the same thing. So they didn't really consider middle or emerging powers, and that's a flaw in that. That was just, they were looking at Great Britain's maritime experience as inspiration. Space strategy is for everybody, for middle and emerging powers. So if you're going to have a work that covers it and want to take on an enduring aspect of what that strategy should be, it should be encompassing for everybody. So, and it should include the capabilities such as commercial. So again, you have to use what you can, but then extrapolate. And when you extrapolate, if you can pull to other seminal works on strategic theory and the like, there's benefits there. And that's what I try to do, is fill in the holes on that. On the similarity side, Julian Corbett says the purpose of maritime strategy is to ensure access to and use of the seas, sea lines of communication. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do in space. So we had navies back then that it was very complicated to have shipbuilding capability. It took years or decades to build your ships and have your lumber. And then once you got to sea, it was you had to defend your access to seas. Space is complicated too. We say space is hard. We kind of take space launch for granted, but there are failures at times getting to orbit. So that takes not all space powers have space launch capability. So you mentioned like there's this tiering structure. And then once you get to space, you got to be able to access it. But there's some benefits and downsides for using maritime.
Yeah, thank you. And so something that you kind of started to talk about is how space is used as a part of general warfare. Not everyone has every capability, like space launch, for example. And so I want to kind of tease out, you say, space warfare is a subset of general warfare, and maybe can't actually determine the outcome of a war on its own. My personal opinion is that we've seen this play out a bit on the battlefield in Ukraine. Space has certainly made a large impact, and especially in the early days and weeks of the war, most publicly through military and civilian communications, through SpaceX's Starlink, which I'll maybe say helped equalize the playing field a little bit. But I don't think it's helped determine the outcome of the war on its own. Clearly they're still in the middle of that conflict. So does this sound in line with your thinking? And can you kind of break down that role that space plays in conjunction with warfare in other domains on a more strategic level?
That's a key point. And, when Corbett wrote, he was writing about how navies support actions ashore, this land-based reference. Going back fundamentally, what is war and warfare? Clausewitz will say it's an extension of policy or politics. That has a terrestrial reference. These are government state organizations. Most conflicts have a terrestrial reference. This sometimes can get me in trouble, and I don't want folks to take it the wrong way. Space power is important. Sea power is important. Even though it can influence a decision or a conflict, it is probably not going to decide it alone, because fundamentally you have to affect where people live and the politics there. So right now that's terrestrially on Earth. Maybe someday we'll go off and be on other planets, but that's just the nature of the business. That doesn't mean it's not important, and this argument of brown water versus blue water, is the purpose of the Space Force to support the terrestrial warfight? But it's also the blue water analogy. Space Force and all space powers need to have space-to-space effects, because if a rival is threatening your capabilities, you need to be able to address that too. But to your question, it's going to be mostly supporting, but supporting in an important way.
Thank you. And once you get into warfare, you often have, you have offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities. You make the point in your book that, an offensive strategy might not be best. It might be defensive. We were talking a bit before this. I'm not a professional strategist, but I am a big sports fan. So I'll use the analogy that defense wins championships. I might use the analogy that a strong offense might help you win a game or maybe a smaller specific battle, but a strong defense might be the key to winning the championship or a long-term success in a months or years-long war. So as a professional warfare strategist, can you talk a bit more about these pros and cons of offense and defense and why you believe defense is most important in warfare?
Thank you for the question. So this is one where I tend to deviate with the conventional thinking in the community. So there's this idea that space warfare is offense dominant. But we'll backtrack. What's the purpose of space strategy? It's to ensure access to and use of space. That is nothing to say about the purpose of space warfare is to destroy your rival's capabilities. If I can access space and I can use space, that's good enough. Now, if your rival's threatening it, then you're going to have to take decisive action. But, the offense is, looking at Corbett's writing and Clausewitz, it's what they call the stronger form of action. And you need to have offensive effects to bring a conflict to conclusion. I'm not trying to diminish that. It doesn't mean attacking first, because if you're attacking first, but your adversary knows the time and place that you're attacking, maybe there's no benefit. But where do we deviate? So the defense is the stronger form of action, according to Clausewitz and Corbett. So what does that mean? So two equal units meeting on the field of battle in land warfare, the one that took defensive fortifications was in the stronger position. For the defense to be the stronger form, you have to make preparations. It doesn't mean just doing nothing. In the space community, this has to do with space mission assurance and resilience. So we see a lot of that talk, but because we know the capabilities of our rivals, we have to decide today what capabilities we want, defensive, mission assurance and resilience, and some of the weapon systems that we're talking about in later today. So we can talk more about that if we want to talk about first mover advantage, but That's my view, and for the folks who disagree, I would say I have Clausewitz on my side, so there.
So I'll get to first mover advantage in a little bit here, but that kind of reminds me too of this concept of space superiority. So again, my understanding is that for air superiority, for example, it's the concept that if you can control the air, you control everything or have a grasp of everything, on the layers under. You discussed that space superiority, which is a term we hear pretty commonly, even used by Space Force officials as something that's necessary to success in the domain. You think it's a bad concept again. So can you kind of explain exactly what space superiority means and why you don't quite buy into that same idea?
Okay. Yeah, this is an area where I sometimes disagree with folks. There's multiple definitions of space superiority. There's a few that I actually like. It's just in the common parlance. So basically it means that you have freedom of action in space. You can use space and your rivals or adversaries cannot. That's the idea of space superiority came from air power doctrine, from air superiority. So what's my beef with it? The way we use it is that you have it or you don't. It's used in an absolute sense, kind of like how we throw around air superiority. So we want to achieve air superiority. By extension, we want to achieve space superiority. Sometimes folks will say, hey, the U.S. is the greatest space power. We obviously have space superiority over our rivals. Space is big, if not infinite. So when we say we have space superiority on the U.S. side, we're talking about we have it in the near-Earth orbits. Okay, you can't have it everywhere. So what I like about the maritime analogy, when their idea of sea control or command of the seas, is there's a spatial and temporal dimension. So you have to decide on where you want to have superiority and for how long. And back to the point that space strategy is for everybody, for middle powers, they may not have the same capabilities and technical means that we have in the U.S., but they have ambitions too and want to protect interests. So this temporal and spatial dimension, maybe they want to have superiority over the field of battle in LEO, or maybe they want to take action in geostationary orbit for a specific period of time. That's more reasonable by achieving superiority.
Thank you. And so, you kind of mentioned this in the sea. There's maybe a difference between space superiority and command of space. You have a chapter in your book that explains that this command of space is the ability to secure one's access to space for various purposes while denying or restricting an adversary's use of space. So can you kind of explain that difference between space superiority and command of space?
Yeah, so it's that's just the finer points of the temporal and spatial dimensions. I was told from a Space Force guardian, we are never going to use the terminology command of space. And the jargon is the jargon, and that's not going to change. But the closest by extension would be space control. So, and I like that over space superiority because you exercise space control for a time and a place. And that kind of makes sense. So, back in the age of sail, maybe Great Britain just cared about the channel against maybe the French legions coming across. Likewise, in the space domain, maybe we care, 90% of our satellites are in LEO right now, which we can talk about if that's necessarily a good thing. But maybe that's where our interests lie under some occasions. So command of space and by extension, space control, again, is what location and for how long. On the U.S. side, we may be able to have persistent coverage in large orbital regimes just because we have so much capability. There is talk about cislunar capabilities, what's the role of space domain awareness and what type of systems we should have out there. So that's, again, this spatial dimension. Is this becoming a national security interest as we send astronauts and basing to the moon?
Yeah, thank you. And as we start doing these things that we have not done very much before, I want to go back to a point that you made earlier on first mover advantage, another kind of controversial topic in the space policy community. You say that there is no inherent first mover advantage in space, or maybe no second mover disadvantage, to put it another way. Can you talk a bit more about how you reached this conclusion?
Yeah, so this gets me in trouble as well. And I'll say it for the folks listening and for listening to this recording, there is no inherent first mover advantage in space. What we have instead is really bad operational concepts. All right, so let's back that up. Going back to Clausewitz, some people say he was writing about land warfare, but most people understand he was talking about general warfare. The defense was the stronger form of action because you took those preparations. We built castles with high walls. We had a moat around the castle. We had a drawbridge. So you made preparations so when the enemy's forces came along, you could withstand a siege and hopefully be victorious. So two equal forces meeting on the field of battle. If I made preparations, I should have a stronger form of action or have the benefit. Back in colonial times in the United States, there was this very odd way of fighting when we used to line up soldiers in an open field, maybe too deep, and trade volley fire. Sometimes the officers would meet on the field of battle and decide who would actually shoot first and who would shoot second. In that arrangement, you didn't want to go second, okay? You're putting your troops in a highly vulnerable position without making preparations that take into advantage the defense. So you may say, in colonial times, was the defense the stronger form of war? Yes, it was, but the leaders, military leaders, decided to take on stupid operational concepts that put their forces in a vulnerable position. I think what's happened is that we translate, as we moved away from the sanctuary model of thinking about space, we have high-value assets, exquisite systems that are highly vulnerable. We've had folks, military leadership, call them big, fat, juicy targets. That's not what we want. Just like putting your troops in an open field to take a headshot, we don't want to put our exquisite systems so they can be taken out. So this, we know this idea through space mission assurance and resilience, distributed architectures, different orbits, maybe non-space solutions. Those are some of the preparations that will be a better operational concept.
Thank you. And so that kind of plays into my next question, which is, in space, sometimes if you negatively affect your adversary, you can negatively impact yourself too and put your own assets at risk. An obvious example of that would be an anti-satellite test that would destroy a satellite of an adversary and leave debris in an orbit that, our assets might also occupy. And this also impacts, what you call these celestial lines of communications that are shared. So can you discuss that a bit more and kind of talk about these celestial lines of communication?
Yeah. So that's a key point. Celestial lines of communication, we call them clocks. It's a fundamental difference in maritime strategy versus land strategy. So I'll use a little visual. In land warfare, the lines of communication usually ran internal to the country where fighting forces would meet like this. At sea, the lines of communication are shared with your belligerent. And that holds true for space as well. What does that mean? It means you can't take offensive action against your adversary without the potential of impacting yourself. And this is why large-scale debris generating effects are frowned upon and are in line with what's said in the DoD tenets of responsible behavior. We want to avoid long-lived debris, especially if, unfortunately, a conflict happens in space. So if you do jamming, maybe you take away from your adversary, maybe you take away from yourself. If you're going to have lasing effects, you got to be careful that you're not damaging your own electro-optic sensors. So that's fundamental. You have to take into account that you're not impacting your forces or didn't think through how you're going to use your military effects in space.
Thank you. And so thinking, in space right now, we have so many satellites in LEO, as you mentioned. The largest satellite operator right now is not a government. It is SpaceX, a commercial company. So what role do non-state actors like commercial companies play in the concept of, command of space, and how might their growing presence impact the strategies of more traditional space powers?
Yeah, it's huge. And this is where you have to kind of deviate from the maritime analogy a little bit. But, we look at the curve of satellites on orbit is just exponentially growing. A lot of those are commercial. In this case, it's mostly SpaceX. So what is the impact to strategy? It is profound. So, we have, we have the DoD's commercial integration strategy. We have the Space Force's commercial space strategy, all looking to commercial innovation and capabilities for strategic advantage. Outcompeting rivals in this area of competition. So, this is in line with, a lot of the writings of Sun Tzu from 2,000 years ago, trying to achieve strategic advantage or asymmetric advantage with the capabilities that you have. It is remarkable just watching all the tech and all the gains that commercial companies are having. It's happening so quickly. What are some other profound areas? And this bears out from Ukraine. We're seeing the role of commercial as proxies and as proxy war. So Putin has said he sees SpaceX's Starlink as an extension of the United States. That has some significant consequences in times of conflict. Do we think that U.S. rivals are going to go after our commercial capabilities? I'd say it's probably fair to say if they're providing significant capabilities, they're going to be gone after in some capacity. But I like to flip it. For our folks in uniform, are you going to go after the commercial capabilities used by rivals or third-party entities in conflict? And sometimes I get of course we are, Patsy. Why wouldn't we? And then the policy and legal folks sometimes suck their teeth because we have this law of armed conflict. We try to separate the military from the non-military object to protect the rights of civilians. This is the dialogue that's going on in the Middle East again. So what is the appropriate use of force when you have non-combatants? In this case, what's the role of using weapon systems when there's commercial or neutral? So this is a sticky question. It's one that we need to discuss with our allies.
Yeah, thank you. And this kind of reminds me of one of the chapters of your book called Astropolitics, where you talk about, geopolitics as applied to space. So can you talk a bit more about that and how traditional geopolitics can impact space operations? Do traditional geopolitical strategies, do they change when space is involved or when a nation is investing in their space capabilities?
So a quick primer on geopolitics. Halford Mackinder was a British academic, coined the term geopolitics. Colin Gray took that on in his years talking about, but what is geopolitics? It's understanding that military strategies have to consider the interconnectedness of geography. So for Mackinder, it was the heartland, just looking at where all the abundance of wealth and grain and farming was. That's where countries would fight over. In space, we have geographic, we'll call them astrographic concerns. We have launch positions. We have highly used orbits, maybe LEO. We now have resource extraction locations, potentially on the lunar South Pole. We have highly valuable satellites. We have space stations. So the geography is different. And one area I want to emphasize is it includes spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum. So some spectrum is highly desirable than others. We're seeing fights over spectrum, especially as the U.S. and China launch these low Earth orbit mega constellations. How is the spectrum going to be hashed out? So, the geopolitics breaks down. You got to kind of tweak it for space, but there are some physical and electromagnetic concerns that we can take into account, and that will shape strategy, and it has for some time.
Thank you. And kind of, talking about that, there's this concept of, flag follows trade. And as you discuss in your book, that might influence international relations in space, particularly as the space ecosystem and, the space economy kind of takes off and is intertwined with the activities of other nations. So what sorts of dangers and maybe, responsibilities do we open ourselves up to?
So the flag follows trade argument, we could debate actually which one comes first. Sometimes, but let's just say, simplify it, governments care about their commerce and trade. So I've seen some numbers. We say we have a space economy of about $380 billion. Some organizations are putting this at the future in the trillions. That's significant, and countries care about that. Corbett doesn't really talk that much. Well, when he talks about commerce and trade, he's actually talking about deterrence. So he's saying, a sea power can impact a rival's commerce and trade for deterrent effect. And that's certainly the case too. But in the U.S., we're seeing this manifested in other ways. We talk about hybrid space architectures. So this intermingling of, I love commercial so much, I want to include it in my architectures, and I want to build this hybrid architecture. There's some potential downsides to that. So there's been David Koplow has written about some of the potential unintended consequences. Are we making it hard or more difficult for our rivals to distinguish between the military and the non-military object? If you're intermingling government military systems with commercial, how do you target one and not the other? So there's some law of armed conflict concerns, some policy questions. Our allies are wrestling with it too, but I don't see commercial slowing down in any means, and I think this question will just be going on for the next few years.
Thank you. I'm wrapping up my questions here, and I want to remind our online audience again that we are taking live questions. Something we haven't talked about is the cyber domain. Though not officially designated, there is, I think, a lot of intersection between space and cyberspace or the cyber domain with strategic operational implications. What is that relationship between space and the cyber domain, and how are they kind of uniquely interconnected?
So this has been a topic I took on in the second edition, wasn't around. I had been wrestling with it, especially given what we saw in Ukraine. So just for context, before the Russian invasion into Ukraine, we saw the cyber attack against the U.S. commercial company Viasat. So this idea of using cyber attacks against a space company for military or strategic advantage. Corbett writes about the interdependence of the seas and land. So we know space warfare and military operations in space are interconnected with the other domains. My working hypothesis, yet to be proven, but I'm encouraging my students to take it on, of all the other operational domains, I see cyberspace as being the most impactful for space. And why do I say that? So I include a figure in the book. It talks about the strategic elements of space and cyberspace. So the lines of communication, they share the informational environment and network dimension and the link segment. Common attributes, unclear norms of behavior, attribution difficulties, and transnational equity. So a lot of the same strategic concerns. And what also ties them together is, we always forget about the ground segment, the end user in the space architecture. So let's not forget about the end user, the ground segment. So that's where your downlink stations are, that's where your networks are. So just by the very nature, we've included networks and cyberspace into what we consider space architecture. So that's, again, goes to my hypothesis that the two are interconnected. What is the so what? I think what we're going to see is military action in the space domain may translate into a resulting effect in the cyberspace domain, and rivals may take action in one against the other. I'm not exactly sure. It's a work in progress, but I look forward to continuing this line of reasoning in the future.
Thank you. And just to kind of throw another thing at this complex environment, what role should the commercial sector play in ensuring the cybersecurity and resiliency of our space capabilities? I mean, the Viasat example that you mentioned, that directly impacted a commercial company. SpaceX, another commercial company, kind of jumped in to give Starlink, to kind of replace that Viasat that had been targeted. So what role does the commercial sector play in all of this?
It's really important. And, when a commercial company friend of mine, actually from Viasat years ago, says, hey, Patsy, if we have a cyber attack, if our services are denied, we're out of business. So for a lot of these large companies, they understand the importance of cyberspace attacks, having robust systems, because they'll be out of business pretty quickly. And I would argue a lot of these companies may have better cybersecurity protocols than some countries, based on experience. So if we look at what's in current U.S. national space policy, we have cybersecurity direction for commercial companies to make sure that they take those measures. I see this as a growing area. I would expect the next few years, the incoming administration, whoever that will be, will take up that banner of improving cybersecurity and emphasizing commercial's role in that.
Thank you. Next I have a question from one of our fantastic interns. The Aerospace Security Project and CSIS in general are lucky to have some really phenomenal interns, all of which have been really interested by your book. So we might do a little, intern speed round here. But from Shayna Gersten, who read this book this semester, she says, you discussed China's recent advancements in rendezvous and proximity operations. How do those operations reflect China's broader strategy in space warfare capabilities? And how might these capabilities be used for military advantages or even counter space operations? What capabilities should the U.S. Space Force ensure that our own ecosystem has in light of the progress of other nations in these counter space capabilities?
Thank you for that question. It's a fundamental difference on how the PRC and the United States and Western liberal democracies consider deterrence. So we've seen impressive rendezvous and proximity capabilities by the PRC. CSIS's own threat assessment has highlighted that, SJ21. The idea of movement and maneuver is an enduring principle that goes back to land warfare, maritime strategy, and the like. So we see the same idea of movement and maneuver in space. What can you achieve with that? So if you read a lot of the deterrence theory from the PRC, a lot of Dean Cheng's writings too, he'll note that PRC sometimes uses technology demonstrations of capabilities for deterrent effect. So whether it's a test or a demonstration. So for the PRC, if they know you're watching and they have a capability that they want to demonstrate, they understand that that's going to have a potential deterrent effect to influence U.S. decision calculus. What should the U.S. do? There's been a lot of talk about movement and maneuver, dynamic space operations, maneuver without regret. So what are the capabilities that our folks are looking at? If you want to have sustained maneuver capabilities, maybe we need on-orbit refueling capabilities. Maybe we need to have more tugs, better propellant. Maybe look at nuclear power for some endurance maneuver capabilities too. But this idea that maneuvering and maneuvering quickly can give advantage, that is enduring and needs to translate to the space domain.
Thank you. Another question from one of our fantastic interns here, Yanni Nikas. How do you expect different nations, say the U.S. and China or other, even developing space nations, to interpret space strategy differently? Do you expect there to be significant differences, or do you think that, as you're watching different countries develop space policies, develop their own, military branches of space, invest in their commercial market, do you see them kind of thinking about this the same way, or do you see some pretty big differences?
Thank you, Yanni, for the question. There's big differences on how great powers consider space strategy, how the U.S. considers it, and then middle powers, we'll say a lot of our European friends, and then also emerging space powers. So I studied under the late Colin Gray. He would always lament, "You Americans don't do strategy." And his point was, we are blessed and fortunate to have a lot of kit, technology, means, and sometimes we just throw things at a problem and muddle our way through and see how it works. Middle powers or medium powers have a more difficult problem. They may have the same aspirational goals as great space powers, but not the same financial or technical capabilities. So they care more about strategy. They need to know where every euro, pound, or whatever goes more so. So they're more intentional with their strategy. Strategy is balancing ends and means. If I have financial means, what kind of aims am I going to achieve? It's fundamentally different. For emerging powers, they may just want to become a space power. Maybe they want to procure the commercial launch services to have their own satellite capabilities for satellite communications or the like, or use it for prestige purposes, or even having their own astronaut on space station. So it's widely ranged, and that's why space strategy is for everybody, and that's why I try to tackle in this book.
Thank you. So another one of our interns, Jacob Bradley, asks, what do you see as the greatest strengths and weaknesses of the U.S.'s current space strategy? I think maybe you took your mentor, the late Colin Gray's words that the U.S. doesn't care about strategy. Maybe that changed your life's work into publishing all of these books and, being one of our great space strategists. So what do you see, as those strengths and weaknesses as the U.S. thinks more about space strategy?
Thank you, Jacob, for the question, and thank you for the kind words, maybe more than I deserve. Strengths and weaknesses. Well, we kind of touched on this idea of space superiority. We kind of threw out these terminologies like we're going to just have it. Strategy, you may need to focus on deciding which orbital regimes are more important. Do you need to have space control for a specific amount of time? Being more intentional with communicating, what our strategy is and how it's achieved. Sometimes they can be more aspirational than helpful. And in the last chapter of this book, I give some policy recommendations, mostly from a Western context. There's 8 of them, and the top 4 are non-material solutions. So we can make improvements to our strategies and our policies without more people, without more money. It just changes in operational concepts, doctrines, strategies, and policies, and just the way we think. So sometimes we like to focus on the kit or the satellites because we like shiny things in space. But sometimes it's more the mundane. You can be transformational or have a third offset or whatever it is just by changing the way you think and operate.
Thank you. And another question from the audience is, how did the creation of the U.S. Space Force affect U.S. space strategy? And where do you see that path leading us?
I didn't bring it up earlier in the talk. So it lets us be more comfortable with talking about military means. When I started writing over 20 years ago on this, I always said the giggle factor was high. There was only like 5 of us at the time that were writing on this stuff. And, in this role of Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever the joke was, we're beyond that. It's not so funny anymore as we look at the competition. I will point out, the Space Force has been really good about taking on the maritime analogy approach. If you look at the Space Capstone publication, that was the first doctrine publication of the Space Force from 2020, and the list of contributors, it'll show Julian Corbett from 1911 for his Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. So I would say he's the oldest contributor to space power thinking out there. So that's good to see. And Space Force is, they're taking great strides. Sometimes I think internal to the national security space community and external, we're kind of hard on the Space Force. We want to establish culture right away. We want everyone to know about what the Space Force does. Give it time. It's only been a few years. And to be blunt, sometimes you have to have combat experience as a service before this cultural identity starts to take hold.
Thank you. Another kind of buzzword that we hear a lot in space right now is cislunar, something that you mentioned earlier. I'm curious, do you think that, these strategies and principles of space warfare will extend to operations on the moon or in cislunar space? Our deputy director, Clayton Swope, published a fantastic cislunar report last week called Salmon Swimming Upstream, where he kind of talks about some of the other, governmental designs for different domains. And so I'd love to hear your take on, where you see this, the policy extending or not into cislunar space.
Yeah, so Clayton's paper was wonderful, highlighted a lot of the issues. Sometimes the context of the question gets framed, what is the role of the military in cislunar space and or on the moon? I'll give 2 different answers. You can pick whichever one you want. In the short term, we know we need space domain awareness to know what's going on between the Earth and the moon, whether it's comms, just knowing, as we have more spacecraft going between the Earth and the moon and governments having aspirations there, we should know what's going on. And that's just a basic function. In the U.S., lunar activities is the role of civil space. So that's the NASA is going to have the lead there. I think we need to be clear on that. If it pertains to the surface of the moon, Right now, that's NASA and through the Artemis Accords and the like. So that doesn't mean to diminish the role of the Space Force or other military organizations. But let's, in the short term, there may be no there. As we do more basing operations, as we go to the moon, to Mars, maybe that'll change. But I love the science and exploration side. We don't need to conflate the military means there. But will we see resource extraction? Will countries fight over the best landing sites? TBD. My hunch is, we're all talking about water ice and the craters of the lunar South Pole. My sense in the regolith, there may be other water ice that we just don't really fully understand, and maybe our technology will catch up where it's more abundant than we think.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from the audience here from Sean Barnes from Polaris Strategic Solutions. What is the role of space capabilities to deter conflict? And I'll add, I think this can be conflict either in the space domain or just conflict, in these other domains on Earth or in air as well.
Great. Thank you, Sean, for that. I'll pay you your $20 afterwards. So now I get to talk about deterrence theory. So we'll do the standard disclaimer. China, Russia's, and the West have different views on deterrence approaches. All three countries are different from each other. For the sake of brevity, I'll focus on the U.S. and the West. The best model, going back to Schelling, Glenn Snyder, and others, we like to talk about deterrence by punishment or cost imposition, or deterrence by denial of benefit. So space capabilities play in both. We'll do the deterrence by punishment. Like two boxers in the ring, me and Sean are in the ring there. I'm not going to mess with Sean because he has a better reach, and he'll knock my block off if we get in a fight. So that's deterrence by punishment. Deterrence by denial of benefit is Sean and I are at the county fair. We're wearing the padded suits, trying to push each other out of the ring. We're getting hot and sweaty and decide to just knock it off and go have a beer. So that's I'm conveying the futility of action. So just like we can talk space weapons, making sure that space capabilities can support the terrestrial warfighter to deliver military effects. Space capabilities can also influence the decision calculus of rivals by conveying the futility of action. That's again through space mission assurance and resilience. So if I have so much capabilities, different orbitologies, not just proliferated LEO, MEO, GEO, non-space solutions, different providers, working with allies and partners and commercial, if I can convey to rivals no matter what you do, you will be unsuccessful. I see that as a more powerful position to be in. You still need both. Sometimes people say, hey, Patsy, you don't see the role of the punishment. You need both because they're mutually supporting. But I see, because of the stark differences in deterrence approaches between the U.S., Russia, and China, a deterrence by denial of benefit approach should play an increasingly larger part.
Thank you. So we're just about running out of time here, but I want to save some time to talk to hear from you about one of, what I think is one of your hot takes, is what I'll call it. In your first edition of this book, you mentioned the need for a space force and a space command to equip and operate assets in space. You can kind of check both of those off of your list. We have them both today. In this edition, you talk about the need for a space National Guard for domestic disaster relief and crisis response. This is a very hot debate right now on both sides. This idea was killed in the NDAA last year, but it's made it back this year. So I kind of want to give you the floor to hear, your pitch for the Space National Guard.
And thank you for that. A lot of times people think I've lost my mind when I start bringing this up, or say, hey, you're a strategist, stay out of organizational design and bureaucracies of what we need, because you can overstep. So like you mentioned, first edition, I tried to take on some organizational challenges. Those came to fruition. So I asked myself, are there any outstanding organizational challenges that, or changes that need to be made that would be helpful? So I don't have a dog in the Space National Guard fight, but it kind of spoke to itself. So we have a difference in U.S. code between Title 32 and Title 10 forces. So the National Guard operates in a few for simplicity, but one of them is Title 32, and that's the role domestically. So I see, because Title 10 forces, the Space Force and all the armed branches are precluded providing domestic support, usually in day-to-day operations, that the National Guard personnel or organizations are better equipped. So what would be a case? Domestic disaster relief or crisis response. So hurricanes were in the news a few weeks back. Hurricane Helene just devastated the southeast. There's this wonderful nighttime image of the southeast with this black swath of no lights going from the Panhandle, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and into the Asheville area. So Space National Guard components would be able to work with first responders, work with relief organizations to prioritize which areas should get relief first. They would be able to work with the imagery, work with other organizations, potentially within the IC, to prioritize the collections also. And you can extend it to other type of domestic issues too. But, could Space National Guard give out Starlink terminals to the folks without internet or cell phone? Stuff like that. I think there's a there. There's a lot of, like you mentioned, the White House is against this idea. A lot of important thinkers in the space community are against this idea. I will caveat that if your argument is it will cost more money, require changes to organizations and bigger bureaucracy, those were the same arguments against the U.S. Space Force at the time. So I would say the U.S. has a demonstrated history. If there's a mission need that needs to be filled, that they will grow organizations and spend more money. And we'll let the smarter people than me figure this out, but the Space National Guard may be one of those.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I think that's a great place to end this. So thank you so much for taking the time to kind of talk through your book and to explain some of these terms that we hear a lot in space that can get a bit lost. Mm-hmm. So really appreciate you taking the time to break all this down for us. So thank you again. I want to also thank our director, Kari Bingen, for her words at the beginning, and our ASP team, Kendra Lefebvre and Shayna Gersten, for all their help putting this event together. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.